I am writing this under a mental strain I can no longer bear. By tonight, I will be gone. I am penniless. My supply of the drug, the only thing making this miserable life endurable, is finished. I cannot survive the torture any longer. Soon, I will throw myself from this attic window down into the squalid street below. Do not think me a coward. Do not dismiss me as a weakling ruined by morphine. Once you read these hastily scrawled pages, you might begin to understand. You will realize why I must choose forgetfulness or death. It started in the open Pacific. My cargo ship was captured by a German sea raider. It was the very beginning of the Great War, and the enemy was still merciful. We were naval prisoners, but we were treated fairly. So liberal was our captivity that 5 days later, I managed to escape. I slipped away alone in a small lifeboat, carrying only water and basic provisions. But I had no idea where I was. I was no navigator. I could only guess, watching the sun and the stars, that I was somewhere south of the equator. Of my longitude, I knew absolutely nothing. No islands were in sight, no coastline. Just days of aimless drifting under a scorching sun. The heat was blinding. The ocean was an endless, mocking desert of blue. In that suffocating solitude, I began to despair. The shift happened while I slept. I still don't know the details. My dreams were dark and troubled, but my slumber was heavy. When I finally woke, the world had vanished. I was half sucked into a slimy, hellish plain of black mud. It stretched out to the horizon in endless, nauseating ripples. My boat was grounded yards away, tilted on its side. The air was thick, putrid. It smelled of rotting fish, mixed with things I couldn't even bring myself to describe. Unnameable carcasses protruding from the wet, dark slime. It is impossible to put into words the absolute horror of that place. The silence was heavy, suffocating. It was a vast, dead landscape. Its stillness filled me with primal, nauseating fear. The sun blazed down from a sky that looked almost black, reflecting the inky mire beneath my feet. I crawled back into my stranded boat. Only one theory made sense. An unprecedented volcanic upheaval had pushed the ocean floor to the surface. Lands hidden for millions of years were now exposed to the open air. There were no seabirds. There was no sound of waves. Just endless, silent death. For hours, I sat in the shade of the tilted boat, waiting. As the day went on, the mud began to dry, losing its stickiness. I slept poorly that night. The next day, I packed what food and water I had left. I had to travel. I had to find the ocean or find rescue. By the third morning, the ground was solid enough to walk on. The stench of rotting fish was overwhelming, but I forced myself forward. I walked west, guided by a distant mound that rose above the flat desert. I walked all day. I camped. I walked the next day, yet the mound seemed no closer. Finally, on the fourth night, I reached its base. It was much higher than it had appeared from a distance, separated from the plain by a deep valley. Too exhausted to climb, I slept in its shadow. My dreams were wild, terrifying. Before the waning moon even rose, I woke up drenched in cold sweat, determined never to close my eyes again. In the pale moonlight, I realized my mistake. Traveling by day under the parching sun was exhausting. The flat monotony of the mud plain had filled me with a quiet dread. But what I saw when I reached the peak of the hill was infinitely worse. I looked down the other side into a colossal, pitch-black chasm. The moon was still too low to light its depths. I felt like I was standing on the very edge of the earth, peering into a bottomless pit of eternal night. It felt like a descent into the deepest realms of darkness. But as the moon climbed higher, I saw the slope was not vertical. Ledges and rock formations offered footholds. Driven by a strange, irresistible impulse, I scrambled down. I descended hundreds of feet into the darkness until I stood on a gentler slope, staring into the silent abyss. Then, something caught my eye on the opposite slope, about 100 yards away. A massive object, gleaming white in the newly cast rays of the moon. It was a gigantic stone, but its shape was too perfect. Its position was too deliberate. As I stared, a cold dread washed over me. Deep inside a chasm that had lain at the bottom of the sea since the dawn of time, there stood a massive, well-shaped monolith. It was the work of intelligence. It was built by living, thinking creatures. The moon reached its highest point, lighting the canyon. At the very bottom, a dark, silent river flowed, almost touching my feet. Across the water, the gentle waves washed against the base of the towering stone. Now, I could see its surface clearly. It was covered in hieroglyphs and carvings. The symbols were ancient, depicting sea life, fish, octopi, crustaceans, and strange marine monsters I had never seen in any book. Monstrous things whose rotting bodies I had just passed on the dried ocean. Then, the water stirred. There was only a slight churning, no splash, just a heavy, silent movement. And then, the thing rose to the surface. It was colossal, loathsome, a monument of nightmares. It darted through the water toward the monolith. It flung its giant, scaly arms around the stone, bowing its hideous head. From its throat came a series of measured, terrifying sounds. I think my mind broke in that moment. I barely remember my escape. I remember scrambling up the cliffs in a panic. I remember running blindly across the dark desert. I think I sang. I think I laughed when I could no longer sing. Later, there was a storm, thunder, lightning, nature screaming in its wildest moods. But my memory of it is nothing but a blur of terror.
When I finally came out of the darkness, I was in a hospital in San Francisco. The captain of an American ship had spotted my drifting boat and pulled me from the sea. In my fever, I had raved. I had said too much, but no one listened. They knew nothing of any land upheaval in the Pacific. I didn't bother to convince them. They would never believe me. Once, I visited a famous ethnologist. I asked him about Dagon, the ancient Philistine fish god. But he was too conventional, too safe. I dropped the subject. Now, I live in constant terror. It is always worse at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning. That is when I see it. I tried morphine. It gave me temporary peace, but now I am its slave. There is no escape, so I must end it. I have written this full account to warn my fellow men, or perhaps just to amuse them. I ask myself if it was all a dream, a hallucination born of fever and sunstroke in that open boat. But every time I ask, a terrifying vision appears in my mind. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering. I think of the nameless things that are crawling on the ocean bed right now, worshipping their stone idols, carving their hideous faces onto underwater monuments. I dream of the day they will rise, the day the land will sink, and the dark ocean floor will ascend, dragging a war-exhausted mankind down into the deep. The end is here. I hear a noise outside. A wet, slippery sound. Something immense and heavy is lumbering against my door. It will not find me. God, that hand.